So I think I need to apologize to Jose up front. I understand he has an active presence in social media, and I'm sure this all is a bit disappointing for him. So, and probably the rest of you as well. So apologies to you all. Marriage. So when we look at marriage cross-culturally, what we find is that, again, like with religion, from a kind of a functionalist perspective, is, marriage is answering questions, it's solving problems, and a lot of them are the same from culture to culture. And so some of the things that we find cross-culturally are controlling of sexual relations. We certainly find social responsibility as it relates to children. The marriage practice can reduce conflicts within and between cultures. It can reinforce social bonds within and between cultures. And then, of course, quite obviously, there is an economic aspect to this. When we think about marriage, there's lots of definitions of marriage, and what I'd like to point out to you is that while our culture does historically has been more about heterosexual monogamy, nuclear families, that's our culture. Most of the cultures in the world don't prefer monogamy. They prefer polygamy. And so when we talk about defining marriage as an anthropologist, we have to craft a definition that captures the variety. And so we can't use a definition like the state of being united to a person of the opposite sex as husband or wife in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. And of course, in the United States, that definition no longer suffices because we now have legal homosexual marriage, also called marriage. And so even that definition, which seems fairly common to most, doesn't really work anymore. And so here's a good definition of marriage from an anthropological perspective. Marriage is a culturally sanctioned union between two or more people that establishes rights and obligations between them and their children and also their in-laws. And these rights and obligations include, but are not limited to, sex, labor, property, child rearing, various exchanges, and then also status. And so when it comes to marriage, it's not quite a cultural universal. We find it in most of the cultures in the world, but we don't find marriage in every culture in the world. There are some that don't practice marriage, but we do find it in most marriages. And one of the reasons, one of the benefits of marriage can be, assuming that the rules are there and are enforced or followed, it can be a restriction of sexually transmitted infections, and that's assuming that they have rules that constrain sexual contact to just the people involved in the marriage. And as an aside, you've probably mostly heard of sexual STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, as opposed to STI, sexually transmitted infection. And from an anthropologist, you'd probably be more likely to hear STI. And at least in part, there are, and I would bet money that most of you know someone who's had a STI at some point. And sometimes people are so ashamed of having an infection, this type of an infection, because our culture has constructed it in such a way to be ashamed of. Um, People are so ashamed that they don't seek treatment, and this can have catastrophic impacts on people's lives. And so, when we talk about these types of infections, they're infections, they're not diseases, and it's not something to be ashamed of. I today canceled class for the first time ever. I've never canceled a class for illness. I probably have the flu, but nobody's going to ask me or require me or try to shame me for being ill, this type of an infection. But we certainly do shame people for very kind of naturally acquired types of infections with STIs or STDs. So we've talked before about, does it matter how we talk about things? And maybe it does. That's part of culture, and it certainly shapes perspective.